The scream that shattered the quiet came from a narrow street in a Tokyo suburb, where a father realized his 4-year-old daughter had vanished in the short moment he stepped inside to answer a phone. She had been laughing on the backyard swing only seconds earlier, dragging her heels through the dirt as she tried to push herself higher. Now the swing moved on its own, drifting in slow, uneven arcs that felt wrong the instant he saw them. Her toys were still scattered on the ground. Her shoes were still in the grass. The father shouted her name and ran toward the gate with a panic that pulled neighbors from their homes. People spread through the streets, checking cars, alleyways, and sheds, calling the child's name over and over. Police arrived quickly and swept into the wooded strip behind the houses, searching every shadow until nightfall. But the child was already gone. A man had stepped out of a parked car, lifted her without a word, and disappeared before anyone noticed the absence of a small voice on an ordinary afternoon. Tsutomu Miyazaki had built his life around isolation. His room was so packed with tapes, comics, and magazines that only narrow pathways remained between the stacks. He avoided classmates, kept his eyes down at work, and rarely spoke except when required. As he got older, the isolation hardened into something obsessive. He moved between part-time jobs, lost interest in daily routines, and spent most of his time consuming the same recordings again and again. Those long hours alone fed fantasies he never discussed and never tried to stop. By the late 1980s, Miyazaki spent his nights driving slowly through the edges of Tokyo, memorizing the rhythms of neighborhoods he did not live in. He watched for small moments when children drifted outside the line of sight of their parents, walking home alone, playing in a side yard, wandering down a narrow footpath. When he saw the little girl on the swing, he circled the block twice to study the timing. When her father stepped inside, he parked, crossed the yard, lifted the child, and carried her to his car. She cried and reached back toward her home, unable to understand what was happening, as he pushed her into the passenger seat and drove toward the wooded hills he had scouted in the days before. He stopped in a clearing shielded by trees, far beyond the reach of traffic or lights. What happened there ended quickly and brutally. He kept what he wanted as souvenirs, destroyed the rest, and returned home before dawn. Meanwhile, the search for the missing child stretched into weeks, widening into neighboring districts. Families taped flyers to telephone poles. Officers rechecked every lead. But they were looking in the wrong places. A few weeks later, a 7-year-old girl disappeared while walking home from a friend's apartment. The reaction was immediate. Patrol cars blocked major roads, helicopters swept overhead. Parents escorted their children everywhere, speaking in low, frightened voices about the possibility of a predator moving through their neighborhoods. Investigators compared the details of the two disappearances. They noted the timing, the age, the lack of witnesses, and the narrow window in which each child vanished. But without physical evidence, they had nowhere to focus. Miyazaki, meanwhile, had moved with the same cold efficiency. He intercepted the girl in a narrow walkway between apartment buildings, forced her into his car, and drove to another isolated location where he repeated his pattern. Afterward, he hid the items he kept from the crime in his room and clipped newspaper articles about the search, labeling them carefully. By the time a third child vanished, fear had overtaken entire communities. Schools implemented strict dismissal procedures. Parents took turns escorting groups of children home. Neighborhood patrols walked the streets through the night, stopping anyone who didn't belong. Police from multiple jurisdictions worked together, comparing the cases line by line. Everything pointed to a single offender, but they had no suspect and no description. Inside his room, Miyazaki watched every broadcast about the disappearances. He recorded news segments, clipped articles, and rewound reports late into the night. The growing attention did not deter him. It encouraged him. When he abducted his fourth victim, a 5-year-old girl, he escalated by contacting her family afterward. The communications were unsettling and deliberate, showing an understanding of their grief and a willingness to deepen it. Detectives who reviewed the messages understood immediately that they were dealing with someone whose confidence was increasing. The break in the case arrived unexpectedly. Miyazaki approached another small child at a park, believing the parent had stepped away long enough for him to act. But the girl's father returned earlier than expected and saw a stranger crouched near his daughter, speaking softly and gesturing toward the parking lot. The father shouted, startling both of them, and Miyazaki bolted toward his car. Several bystanders reacted immediately, chasing him down and blocking the driver's door before he could escape. They held him on the pavement until police arrived. At the station, investigators realized quickly that this arrest might connect to the disappearances. They searched his vehicle and obtained warrants for his home. When officers entered his room, they found towers of tapes and magazines, boxes filled with items belonging to the missing children, and journals detailing scouting routines, methods of approach, and efforts to avoid detection. The evidence filled the room from wall to wall. During questioning, Miyazaki spoke quietly, offering details without emotion. He described the crimes with a calm, flat tone that made even seasoned detectives pause. His statements matched the evidence precisely, confirming what investigators had suspected as soon as they stepped inside his room. The trial drew national attention. Families of the victims filled the courtroom, forced to hear testimony that reopened the pain of the disappearances. Prosecutors presented the evidence chronologically, showing how Miyazaki had targeted his victims, how he carried out the abductions, and how he concealed the crimes. The defense argued diminished responsibility, but the court rejected the claim. The judge delivered a death sentence, calling the crimes among the most severe in the country's modern history. Years passed before the sentence was carried out. When it finally happened, it did not undo the grief of the families or the communities he had terrorized, but it ensured that Miyazaki would never harm another child again. Neighborhoods slowly rebuilt around the memories of the victims, carrying the knowledge that the man responsible would never walk free. Thank you for listening to Homicide Files. Subscribe for more true crime stories.